Hello, everyone. Welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Today, I wanted to talk about something it's an often overlooked tool in any dungeon master's arsenal. Really, any storyteller can make use of this, but it's just something that rarely comes up or really doesn't get thought about a whole lot when it comes to putting together and designing adventures and creating good obstacles for your players, and that is the water. Now, water is an excellent barrier. You only need to take a look at real world historical examples to see just how effective it can be. Building towns and fortresses on islands or near bodies of water, whether it's lakes or rivers. It's just an incredibly useful tool, and it was and still is an important resource, having fresh, flowing water moving through or nearby towns or even your fortresses. And look at just so many different castles. Having a moat built as part of your defenses for your castle was just an invaluable tool to have, and it's invaluable and incredibly useful for you to make use of over the course of your stories and adventures. And it's useful in a lot of different ways. Just as I said, it creates a barrier. It creates a very natural barrier, one that, like I said, most DMs and very much definitely your players don't often consider the water and will underestimate just how dangerous it can really be. Now, there there's an excellent channel out there by Zee Bashaw, um, Zee Bashaw. I have to take a look at that again. I'll post a link in the description below. But in one of his episodes, he actually talks about the water and how dangerous it is. And I've not seen that particular example before, but I do have a few experiences of my own when it came to adventures involving either being on or around water that just really added an extra level of tension and intensity to the course of gameplay over, and the story overall was just made so much better because it was a unique situation that we hadn't really dealt with a whole lot before, and you can do the same thing for your players. For one, like I said, since players will underestimate the effect that water has, you can really use it to surprise them. Um, in a given example, below that you will find with the video link, um, Z takes his character to go try to leap over this channel of water in order to not give up surprise onto to Durgar, who are working away on a forge. Well, he fails and drops in the water, and the DM smiles and says, "You are pulled 30 feet downstream." And well, that doesn't sound like much initially, but the danger here was that he was being yanked and pulled down towards a waterfall, and he eventually fails and just goes flying over the cliff. It's a hilarious and spectacular example of just how dangerous water can be. But that's only one effect right there. Actually, now that I think about it, it's two effects. One, it was a barrier because well, it was a barrier that he tried to clear and failed in the process of all of that, and ultimately ended up dooming his character. There were two perfectly safe travel options there, but he didn't use them because he wanted to act fast and not give up the surprise round. Um, but the in addition to being a barrier there for him to try to leap across, it was also not a trap per se, but definitely a natural hazard that he had to contend with and failed to contend with. And those two uses right there just make water very useful. And if you're running smart and intelligent enemies, villains for your characters, or not even villains necessarily, but opponents, smart and intelligent opponents in these fantasy settings or even historical settings, you will make use of water because while many various class abilities will allow characters to ignore difficult terrain, in my own estimation and taking a look at it, while a water hazard may be part of the terrain, it's not terrain that they can ignore so easily and move so quickly across. So if your players are part of the siege on a castle, or somehow having to clear a decent sized stream or river, that won't all the spaces where the water is deep enough, I would argue, do not count as difficult terrain, even though it is a feature of the terrain. There's nothing that they can particularly do without the aid of magic. If they're using some sort of water walk spell or have some kind of item that lets them hover above the surface of the ground, I'd say it'd even work on the water in that case. But it's a great way for slowing down your players, and if they're particularly heavily armored, they're going to have an even more difficult time trying to cross the water. In my own personal experience running the campaign called the Red Hand of Doom for Dungeons and Dragons Third Edition, there's one particular instance where the characters were going to the ruins of this city. It had long since become a quagmire, this deep swamp, and the buildings had sunk far down into the watery marshes. And part of the cult of the Red Hand, the army of the Red Hand, was set up in the upper tiers of these buildings, still poking out and rising above the water. And they had a black dragon on hand there, and so the local lizard folk tribes had taken to worshiping the dragon and acted as an outer barrier of defense on the outer reaches of this swampy kind of lakeish area. The players decided that they were going to swim across, and most of them actually were successful in swimming and making their way across. The cleric, though, utterly failed. He rolled like a 2 for his swim check, and he was wearing full plate armor. He sank to the bottom like a rock. And he panicked for a moment until he remembered, oh, wait, I have water breathing. And so he cast it on himself, but in walking along the bottom, he took much longer to arrive to the battlefield. So the party was down 1/4 of its strength right there and did a lot to delay his participation in the action. Now, on the other hand, though, because he was underwater, he went unspotted for a long time, and so he was able to use that to his advantage and gained his own surprise round once he joined into the combat, and he made great use of it. But it slowed down his arrival. Now, overall, the players' rolls were going great that night, so they actually weren't hindered too terribly much by missing 1/4 of their team. But once he did join in, suffice it to say, he wrecked a lot of people. And here was this fresh combatant who had only used one spell slot jumping into things. It really tipped the fight in their favor in that particular instance. But even still, just by having this city located in a watery terrain in this overgrown swamp quagmire sort of scenario, I was able to delay one of the characters, and really all the characters kind of were slowed. They could have taken a boat, but that would have potentially alerted the lookouts to their presence, whether it was the lizard folk on the shore or the hobgoblins up in the bell tower for this particular scenario. But there's plenty of other things that you can do, as creatures like lizard folk have a fairly significant advantage when it comes to fighting on and in the water. Lizard folk can hold their breath for quite a long time, much longer than most player characters can without the aid of some sort of magic, like the water breathing spell. And many, many other creatures enjoy these advantages, or even more significant ones, like not even having to worry about holding their breath. I mean, imagine the horror that crosses through the player's mind when they're on a boat and a great tentacle just rises up out of the water and comes crashing down onto the top of the boat, and they realize they're fighting a giant squid or even a kraken as the skies darken and lightning starts being called down from the blackening heavens above. Easily a great moment right there if you're planning an adventure on the water. I mean, ship-based combat, water-based combat adds a lot of unique challenges for the players. For one, they don't quite have as much room as maybe they're normally used to. Also, because if you're like a lot of other players or storytellers running your campaigns, a lot of them tend to be sort of landlocked a little bit. So changing things up and getting them out on the water can really introduce an interesting dynamic because the boat is their lifeline. Not only are they concerned about how well they're doing, but they're concerned with how their mode of transportation is doing, what's keeping them out of the water. So, if a giant sea monster of some variety, whether it's a megalodon, a giant squid, a kraken, or even a sea drake or some other horrific sea monster comes out and begins attacking them, it's massively important that they're not only defending themselves, but working to protect and defend the ship. And on top of that, again, these creatures all have massive advantages on the water. They're adapted and built to survive and be effective at combat in the water. So if the players end up going into the drink, they have to be ready to adapt. And hopefully, you've given them a little bit of time and some resources to make it a little bit more fair. They'll still be at a disadvantage, but if they have some potions of water breathing, or something that will let them operate and function underwater effectively, that'll still make things a little bit more interesting and feel a little bit more fair for them, even though, well, if you're throwing a kraken at them, things might be going a little bit off kilter, but it should still be interesting if they are able to at least drive the creature off, wound it, hurt it, cause it to just kind of follow and tail them for a while it plots how it's going to get revenge. You can make things much more interesting just by switching the location to the water. Now, another example for you. This time I was a player in a D20 Modern campaign. It was a long running campaign, certainly a long running campaign world. A friend of mine was running it, and, well, our characters, working for a mercenary company, decided to take a little bit of time off and go back to the site of a shipwreck. They had, in a previous mission, ended up sinking a ship that was loaded down with all kinds of gold stolen out of various banks, like the and banks and various other places where gold bars had been hoarded up. And, well, we since we placed a beacon on it, we ended up getting our own ship and a submersible to help us with retrieving our sunken treasure. And the course of the adventure had been fairly exciting and intense. There was a giant sized megalodon, duly christened the Nope Fish, once we had spotted it, and it had tailed us for a great deal of this particular adventure. And when we had gotten to the site of the shipwreck, well, we found that there was a massive submarine there. It was an old Russian nuclear submarine. Once we had managed to fight slash sneak our way on board, kind of, we had found that the nuclear silos had been removed, and most of it was a loading cargo space kind of operation located where the missile silos had originally been and the missile launch tubes. And we saw an opportunity here. We saw an opportunity to say, hey, if we can keep on stealthing our way through, picking everybody off. Oh, I should mention the submarine was not crewed by any official Russian government or military members or anything of the sort. It was something that had been stolen and bought by the one of the larger sections of the Russian mob. Not the most realistic thing ever, but you know what? We were in a setting where the Second American Civil War had happened, and uh, the entire world had descended into chaos, and magic is a real thing, etc., etc. So the unusual was happening pretty frequently in this particular story. Anyways, with all this in mind, we slipped aboard and began fighting our way through, but eventually we were found out. We'd gotten spotted. And at this point, the sub had already started diving, going down to the location of the shipwreck so that they could start loading up all the containers themselves. Well, we are underwater on this massive nuclear submarine going deep, deep, deep into the Atlantic Ocean, and we end up getting into a fight on the bridge. And, well, some of the crew died, and not only did the crew die, but they fell in such a way that the steering mechanisms were pushed forward and we started really diving down really fast, really dangerously at a very steep angle. And that steep angle change really impacted the environment, really changed up the angles we were working at, especially once it went just about vertical. And to top it off, the sub started being hit outside. It started being shaken, and we heard metal scraping and tearing in places. And we realized, oh crap, that's the megalodon. That's the giant megalodon out there. Because we hadn't killed it yet. It was still out there and still following us around and chasing us all across the Atlantic. And now it had found something to play with in the deep, dark depths of the ocean. And oh crap, we've really got to get this taken care of. And we start yelling at the player running our techie character. It's like, okay, you're basically the only one we have that can get everything back online. All the systems are down on the bridge. We are going to fight our way down to their computer banks, um, some sort of terminal, and get everything rebooted. We are going to go down to the reactors too. So you have got to stay alive. Immediately next enemy turn, critical hit on our techie, rolled a one on her fortitude save, and dropped to 0 hit points. So now not only are we on a massive nuclear submarine fighting highly organized, highly competent, and very, very terrified and desperate to live members of the Russian mob, but we have a giant megalodon dicking around with the submarine on the outside. And we know that if we keep going straight down like this for too long, we are going to end up crushing this thing like a tin can on the ocean floor. And probably even start crushing it long before then, as the pressure from being underneath, deep, so far down underneath the water, would end up just immediately wrecking the whole thing, especially as the hull was compromised like it was. So we had to move fast, and not only that, we had to move fast, had to fight hard, and keep the techie alive long enough and get her revived, and make sure she survived and made her way back down to the reactor area, to the computer banks, where she could start rebooting the entire system and somehow get control of the submarine and get it leveled out and figure out a way to fight off this giant megalodon before we all died. Even the DM was like, you guys, I think you might be a little bit screwed. I don't know how you're going to get out of this, but we managed to do it. And this exact story got to be so tense. It was so utterly gripping because even though there was no specified time frame that the DM threw at us, we felt like we were under a time crunch just because of the situation at hand. And it's all thanks to the fact that we were in the water, in the deepest, darkest depths of the Atlantic, fighting for our lives while a giant prehistoric creature tore away at this weird little thing that was invading its territory. So, my friends, make use of the water. Players, beware the water. But bear in mind that you can use the water too. And there, by no means is this a full comprehensive scope on all the things that you can do with water. Water makes can make a lot of things very, very interesting. Um, for example, if, I'm sure some of you know, if you spill a decent amount of water on a nice smooth floor, whether it's a tile floor or some kind of linoleum across the top, that creates a very slick environment right there. And if you do such a thing over the course of a game, oh, say you have a magic item that just dispenses a continuous stream of water, you can quickly flood out a battlefield or create a very difficult obstacle to get across, especially for any characters or guards that may be in full plate armor or some other kind of heavy armor. Trying to get across a nice smooth marble floor that's covered entirely in water is a pain in the ass as it is, but couple that with some heavy duty armor, and it's going to be next to impossible for them to be chasing down and catching you more nimble character types. Again, this is not a comprehensive list. There are so many other things you can do with water in the course of a game, and it's not just the D20 games. All the tabletop games can make use of water effectively and entirely, and really add an extra dimension to the story, to the gameplay, and to the combat. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and call it for there. We'll have some more episodes coming out for you folks. Please, if you like that video, hit like and subscribe, and go ahead and click that bell icon so that way you get notified the next time I upload a video here to the Gamers Den. Once again, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. You all have yourselves a good night.